Stacy. No. But no, he's fine. He's fine. You like Are you're still interested in this? In exchange for first year, so 1 year. That's Michael. Well, except it's reality. Writers. You can increase your cost. Just miss the your friend sits right over there. Oh, okay. No, it's gonna be no big. Oh, grab anything you like. Yeah. Oh, you wanna come around here? I'm here.
Janine is good. I was
No. Is it gonna be right? Sign right there. This is your favorite.
I missed your. You came in.
When did it go?
This is the. Oh, what year is it?
Yeah. Are you starting? Yeah.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Noel Latif, President of the Foreign Policy Association. And I have to commend you for braving the heat today to join us. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Nicholas Rostow. I've known Nick since we were classmates in law school. We served together on the editorial board of the Yale Journal of World Public Order, renamed the Yale Journal of International Law. We're delighted at FPA to be participating in the launch of Nick's new book, Proportional to the Mischief, International Law and U.S. Grand Strategy. Nick's many accomplishments include serving as Special Assistant for National Security Affairs to Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. and as legal advisor to the National Security Council under Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft. Nick has held named professorships at the Naval War College, Colgate, Hamilton, and Cornell, and served as university counsel to the State University of New York. I'm told his office was in this building. Nick is currently executive partner at the law firm of Zampano Patricios and senior research scholar at Yale Law School. I am pleased to turn it forward to Nick Rostow.
Well, thank you. No, I'm really delighted to be here, but it's very nice of him to do this, I have to say.
I wish we could have arranged for better weather.
Well, you do what you can do. Okay. And thank you all. I'd also like to say that I think my publisher did a nice job. And even accepted my preference for footnotes instead of endnotes. Maybe the only book that has footnotes instead of endnotes these days. Now, I'm supposed to say something, I'm not quite sure what, but in any event, the book is an argument for considering international law and grand strategy, U.S. grand strategy in particular, together. And normally, these disciplines, like so many intellectual disciplines, don't talk together. And so, while there are shelves and shelves of books in the libraries and a long list of titles on the web, in one subject or another, they don't cross-hatch. There are only two books that I know even try, and they did a long time ago, and took a different view. And the book is also a book about process. One of my bosses, Colin Powell, used to say, good process can't guarantee a good outcome. And so in considering the subject, process is a way in which the two disciplines can be brought together. And the book emphasizes and gives as an example of good process President Eisenhower's solarium exercise, which, as far as I know, was the only disciplined, serious, strategic examination of options ever undertaken by an administration. And it provided the framework, intellectual framework, after the Truman administration for the Cold War. That was because Eisenhower believed in planning. He didn't believe in plans, but planning process. And so he insisted that there be a process. The book originated really in my educational formation as a diplomatic and military historian, and then going to law school and going to work in the State Department, where I quickly found that lawyers had to win over clients in the government as they do in private practice, and they're not the most popular people until their clients realize the lawyers work hard and can take a lot of burdens off their shoulders, and then when clients get into trouble, they can help them sometimes get out of trouble. And sometimes clients like Frank Carlucci learn the lawyers are useful when they're tasked with shutting down something. He was asked by President Nixon to shut down the Office of Economic Opportunity, and that's where he learned that lawyers can be helpful. And he became a great fan of using lawyers. the, the other reason why lawyers are useful, as Colin Powell again used to say, is you have a rear end, so you need a lawyer to protect it. And, but you would be amazed at the number of people who seem to forget that fundamental principle of life. So I encountered, starting in 1985, and it lasted as long as I worked for the government, tremendous resistance on the part of policy people to thinking law and to taking international law serious. Most of them don't. I remember an early conversation with maybe Middle Eastern foreign policy people that we had no use for lawyers at all. Last bunch. It was really to try and show why that's a wrong-headed approach that I decided to work on this book. And what I discovered, however, in my experience is that one can make all the arguments one wants, but human relationships are the key to everything. And for example, in Washington, lawyer shopping is a favorite game. Johnson used to run around Washington talking to different lawyers before they got the one he gave the advice. Even though there was a council, the president was, were all the other lawyers lying around. But law permeates American life, and that's one of the themes of the book, is to remind us all that this is a government, not a person's, and that every question that's important in national life winds up in the courts. And it's a matter of enormous interest to the American people. I remember when we invaded Panama in 1989, and General Powell, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, went out to brief the press. And the first question we got was, how is this lawful? And that's not an isolated event. So what's in the book? Makes the following points in 6 chapters: that we live in an international system of states that includes the balance of power as an operating principle and reality. Today's Wall Street Journal has an article about how great powers are discovering the limits on their power. And I wish the author had read my book, not because it was a bad article, but because he would have known that when he quoted with approval Thucydides' famous statement that in his version of Amelia and Laloi, which I guess is the only version there is, the strong do what they have the power to do, to take what they want, and the weak accept what they have to accept. But he didn't have the answer that Melian's gave right away, which is, in our view, it is at any rate useful that you should not destroy a principle that is to the general good of all men, namely, that in the case of all who fall into danger, there should be such a thing as fair play and just dealing, and that such people should be allowed to use and to profit by arguments that fall short of mathematical accuracy. And this is a principle that affects you as much as anybody, since your own fall would be visited by the most terrible vengeance and would be an example for the world. And that's really the idea at the core of the book, which is that in this international system of states, the sheep tend to gang up on the lions and balance them off. And that's really a legal principle because it insists on limit. And that if you don't have it, then you get Napoleon, you get Wilhelm II, you get Hitler. And limit is at the essence of law, and it's the way in which power is harnessed. The second idea in the book is that over the course of World War I, Woodrow Wilson concluded that respect for and promotion of international law was a vital national interest of the United States. And for that reason, he has had an enduring impact. View of what the U.S. national interest is. I think it's why Nixon, for example, hung his portrait, the cabinet, much to Henry Kissinger's disapproval, which tells you something about the difference between advisors and presidents. Steve Rusk said, advisors get to tell the president, sorry, Mr. President, I was wrong, I resigned. Presidents have to live their decisions. Now, international law gave a great deal of coherence to U.S. grand strategy in the Cold War. That's another point. In important respects, the ideological battle between the communist socialist world and the West involved warring conceptions of international law. And nothing is perfect, and there's no straight line of purity on the side of the United States, impurity on the side of the Soviet Union. But it was a theme, a noticeable and visible theme to the Cold War. And it gave not only coherence, but a way of evaluating U.S. national interests in a world in which a U.S. world in which there's so many voices who insist on being heard and having a role in defining what those interests are. It helps President, Congress, the American people sort of vote for what's important, what's less important. The book argues that the post-Cold War period has seen U.S. grand strategy, if it existed, tethered only erratically to the legal core of the Cold War grand strategy. And the defense of the most important principles of international law really lie foundation of everything. The prohibition of the threat of use of force, except in self-defense. That's going out the window. And so we do often fall back on Thucydides' Melian dialogue. The result, in my view, is nothing short of catastrophic. And then you get events like 9/11, which produced actions based on fear, not on calculation, or respect for law, or sound decision process. And Franklin Roosevelt in itself, and the great power is here. It goes off as a rocket, and the United States, and yet, and the administration of the day was willing to cut process and legally corner in the mistaken belief that therefore it could better protect the country against competition. It was lucky it didn't have a repetition of 9/11, but not because it cut. So the book's basic conclusion is to espouse, as Noel has reminded us, the principle of minimum world order, where we start, because that's a goal, it's an aspiration based on respect for the independence of states and the advancement and protection as possible of human dignity. It is the goal requires constant effort and nurturing, and constant respect from law, because as Grotius said, all things are certain the moment then depart from law. international law is not a panacea, but it can help the United States figure out what international interests are important and how to advance them. And when the United States deviates from domestic and international law and ignores sound decision-making process, it almost always gets into trouble and has to go back to the law the way a drowning person grabs a lifesaver or a sailor looks for a compass. And in a world of nuclear weapons, I really personally see no. The book concludes with some thoughts about what we might do now to build a consensus around our national grant strategy. But to do that requires disciplined thought and process according to law. And then thank you all for coming and having any questions or if you have questions, just sign the books. So. Do you have any questions for our speaker?
Yes. I have, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I don't know if anybody else can. But I'll repeat your question.
Well, I hope it's shorter than that. There's the Desperanzino in Westchester County. It's run by a Guatemala. He grew up on a farm, and he told me that, and president of Guatemala campaigned to control the United Fruit Company. This was in the early 1950s. And by the way, my father, full disclosure, worked for the United Fruit Company. And he says that everybody in Guatemala knows that the US government removed the elected president of Guatemala because of the United Fruit Company. And when we talk about mischief and sovereign states, why did the US overrule the people of Guatemala?
Well, I think basically because the United States had somehow delegated the United Fruit Company its Latin America policy, and with disastrous results. So it's never a good idea.
Guess I'll ask the next question. We were very honored at FBA to have President Franklin Roosevelt give his vision for the UN in our forum, the Yale Law School, just before he passed away. Probably the most important speech that sparked afterwards. The question that I have for you, Nick, is how do you see his vision being translated so that international law can be enforced? Because he did set out this idea that the Security Council would play a very vigorous role in maintaining the peace. What's your assessment of the Security Council? What do you think needs to be done in terms of Security Council reform to encourage the enforcement?
Enforcement has always been the issue, the question raised, how can there be international law enforcement? Just ask the Trump administration and the Canadians. There are ways and ways of enforcing. When Trump started off by going after Canada on trade, somebody, we've lost those bills of paper. And lines of trucks at the border and things grind to a halt, and then you have to find a solution. That's part of the mechanism. The United Nations essentially has been a forum where the balance of power is played out and where the splits between the great powers have been preventing action for most of the life of you. There was a brief period from 1990 to probably 2003, in which the United Nations Security Council acted unanimously most of the time, and except on the Middle East, and where it tried to be effective with but failed miserably with respect to places like Rwanda, Congo, elsewhere. But it succeeded in the sense that it was a place where diplomacy could occur, where adversaries could meet in private and conduct diplomacy. The United States and Iran could have conversations, nobody noticed. The United States and North Korea could. But the fact of the matter is that the world is 193 countries. They don't all share the same perspective. And it's silly to think that they will. But the UN's forum is useful, both because it has programs that are effective to do good, like the World Food Program, and as I say, is an place you can efficiently go and talk to an awful lot of states simultaneously. The vision was that somehow the Allies, Allied unity in World War II would be maintained. And Allied unity in World War II wasn't that great in a lot of respects. I mean, it was effective in beating the Germans and the Japanese, but it wasn't for a want of friction. And so it's how that friction is channeled, how it's controlled, and that's where the law comes in, because it defines rails within which conflict and coercion are supposed to be and should be confined. And that, to me, is what's really at stake in Ukraine and Iran, elsewhere.
You know, international law can be a unifying principle around which parties that can find some accommodation. But if you look at China, if you look at the United States, both the major powers of the world have already violated international. So the genie is out of the bottle, and the question is, how do you bring those significant, powerful countries back in line based on a code of conduct of international law? How can we bring them together?
Well, you have to work at it. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that Putin justifies his invasion of Ukraine with a legal argument. China claims to own the entire South China Sea. They make a legal argument. The United States isn't making legal arguments. Although the State Department Legal Advisor's Office put out a pretty good statement about Iran. Then the fellow who wrote it promptly resigned, I guess, because he didn't get a job. But to me, that's a sign that international law is not dead. It's important. The most cynical countries understand that it's important. And in the long run, it provides a common language. Will it by itself accomplish anything? No. We live in a world of humans. The International Court of Justice tried to say something useful about nuclear weapons and wound up saying nothing useful. Wasted its time and everybody else's. It's up to people to ensure they're not used, and it's going to become more and more difficult as time passes. This disregard for the most fundamental.
When I turn this thing in, I comprehend. President Trump says or implies that the most important thing in his whole life is control of the Iranian nuclear arsenal. what kind of grade would you give him if you were his teacher, A, B, C, D, or F? And what write on his report card based on and the measure that you propose?
About a 0. And the reason is I don't disagree with it, that, it's been US policy for decades to prevent, Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons. And the best that any administration came up with was the Obama plan, which essentially kicked the can to some other administration. And now it appears from this afternoon's news reports that this administration is going to do exactly the same thing. And it is a problem where a government, any government, with nuclear capabilities, or aspiring to have nuclear capabilities, talks about annihilating other countries. Even the International Court of Justice had to say that in such circumstances, where a state's very existence is at stake, it has the right to use nuclear weapons. So, the Iranian problem is for real, but I don't think we're for real.
Question from the Zoom audience. This one's from Ken. Can you go deeper into how specifically good process can bring together international law and U.S. law and grant strategy?
Well, when I worked in the government, which is now a long time ago, there were established decision-making processes where an issue that was difficult was addressed by an interagency process, including lawyers, if it involved anything remotely resembling the use of force. And it went through a process of analysis at different levels until the question was properly teed up for presidential decision. In that process, the different departments and agencies would be represented, and if their heads of agency liked their lawyers, that's what lawyers would want. They weren't, or if they didn't like, say, the legal advisor of the Department of State, Secretary of State, use another lawyer on the staff. We have one here. Very easy enough. So the process in theory brought to the table different views and offered an opportunity for people with different perspectives and interests to make themselves heard. When there was an issue involving the use of force, then all the lawyers in the government get together at the president's behest. And before the 1991 Iran, before Congress had authorized it, the president summoned close to 20 lawyers, cabinet, from all over the government to talk to them about what his authorities were, what would happen if Congress didn't authorize the use of force. What if it did? How much force? Should there be a declaration of war? All these things were discussed by lawyers from all over the government in front of the president. So that's the way it should work. That isn't the way I understand this administration works.
Thank you so much for your remarks. Question from someone who kind of works in more of the industry adjacent sort of aspect of this world. When the mischief moves much quicker than the law does, how would you describe the role of law in sort of that arena, specifically within the realm of non-kinetic warfare, perhaps such as cyber?
I should say that's Boyd Antoine, who's the head of something called Margin Research, which is a very serious cyber company in New York that I've been associated with for years. And the question is of enormous importance, and one of the things it raises is how does it operate? work when the technological context is moving so quickly and it's so difficult to understand that you have sort of monks on one side who understand that and monks on the other side who understand international relations, international law, but don't really understand the components of the context. And I don't have an answer, but I'm organizing a symposium to try and bring those groups of monks together to have a conversation and educate each other. I think we don't have the right words for the cyber world. We talk about cyber attack. We don't really mean cyber attack. It's the constant interaction of computer systems across the internet that involve attack and defense. Cyber war immediately evokes visions of bombs dropping, but that's not really what we're talking about. So it's, we need new words and we need for people to understand better that their little cell phones that they have in their pocket have more computing power than we had when we built the atomic bomb. Yes, sir.
There you go. Go in the other direction. There are a lot of eminent professors like Professor Walden at NYU who are big proponents of the concept of natural rights and moral rights as being something that are important in sovereign dealings as well as in government dealings. How do you see that? You know, I'm somewhat skeptical of that. How do you see the relationship to your use of international law and those concepts of moral and natural rights?
Well, I'm much more mundane than that. I'm not a philosopher, or a theologian. So when one talks about moral and natural rights, one can get into very interesting arguments about what they are, where they come from, and what role they play. But you can point to more concrete things, like the fact that there are 70,000 treaties are now registered with the United Nations that provide a very large pile of paper in which international law is codified. You can point to authoritative documents like the UN Charter. They're going to have arguments about how authoritative decisions of the International Court of Justice are about matters of international law. But the moment you start talking about moral and natural rights, you're getting away from things lawyers like to work with, which are documents, words on paper. And so I don't think that's much of an answer, but it's where my head is. Yes.
If there was one overarching or two overarching things that might help fix the world in terms of international law and making it safer, what, do you have any thoughts?
Well, one of the wisest international lawyers of the last 100 years, Herb Clatterback, wrote a book in 1933 saying if states would only fulfill their treaty obligations, there'd be no war. And states sign up to these things and then pay no attention. I mean, I know that during the first Iraq, the Gulf War of 1991, the Saudis had no idea how to treat prisoners. And they've been originating parties of the Geneva Conventions, 1949, just had no clue. When we invaded Iran and Iraq in 2003, detention operations were not part of the plan, except there was a plan. You know, those whom the gods destroy, they first make mad. So I don't have the answer. But if the United States is going to be a rogue state, we got a whole new kettle of fish to deal with.
Another question from Zoom, this one from Rex. Which countries in the world, in your view, seem to incorporate international law into their grant strategies?
Most of the European countries do. Japan, South Korea, India to a large extent, I would say. A lot of small countries do because they have nowhere else to go. They don't have options. One of the functions of the United Nations is to give small countries leverage, some opportunity to influence their fate. But of the great powers, of the five members of the permanent members of the Security Council, I would say Britain and France at the moment are the best. And they have play too. Sir.
The working of process that you're emphasizing was deeply involved, embodied in the work of the State Department and in congressional committees. They seem to be overarched by lobbyists of contact with them. Do you agree? And if you agree, how can that be resulting?
You know, I think you're right that the State Department and other departments have long established processes. I don't think they've been taken over by lobbyists. Lobbyists perform a function in a democracy of conveying views to decision makers. The fundamental problem now is the absence of process. So if the State Department, as I understand it, doesn't do very much. The National Security Council staff comes to work, collects a paycheck, and doesn't do anything because the president has no interest in decision-making processes and the evaluation of options, determine courses of action and consequences. And so, how we get back to that is up to the American people at ballot box.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. So my question will be on the current United Nations reform, which is called UN80 initiative that launched by Secretary General Antonio Guterres last year on March. And Doctor, how do you envision the future of the international law together with the UN80 reform? UN80 initiative, as we know, it is a response to the current geopolitical and financial challenges that the United Nations is facing today. And how do you envision the role of the United States in that? Because we know that United States recently pulled funds from the United Nations, and we know that they withdrew from the WHO and UNESCO and many other United Nations organizations, which maybe United States also as a member nation of the UN has reasonable, arguments at some point. And how do you envision the current UN80 initiative together with the upcoming Secretary General election that's happening right now? And also, we recently selected a new United Nations General Assembly president. So my question is on that. I'm curious to hear your opinions.
I have to plead ignorance about UN80. I don't know what it is. And I went through the effort to reform the Security Council, and I can hold your breath on that. When I was at the U.S. mission with the UN in 2005, there was a tremendous push to change the composition of the Security Council. Suddenly, every country that had been in arrears found its dues paid. And then it all fell apart, and it fell apart because Germans in a very anti-EU way wanted be permanent members of the Security Council, and everybody said, of course, that's a sensible thing, and nobody believed that one nanosecond. And the Japanese were blocked by China and secretly by everybody else. The Africans couldn't decide who should represent Africa between South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt. The Latin Americans couldn't decide between Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and it all fell apart. So I don't know what the latest reform effort is. I have my own views that the UN as a bureaucracy needs tremendous reform because it still doesn't have adequate ways in which employees who are abused can get can seek repair. Soldiers who are sent to be part of peacekeeping operations are accountable to their governments, not to the UN. So when they commit sexual offenses, it's up to the sending country to deal with, not to the UN bureaucracy. There's a lot of that. So but I'm sorry, I don't know about UN. I should.
Thank you so much.
Sir.
Hello?
Okay, thank you. As you said, we live in a world where the US is acting without making legal justifications, but they seem to be able to do so with little to no restraint. Can you envision a way in which the international system could have been set up in a better way to have been able to impose more restraint on the US?
Well, I think that it's in the nature of a multi-state system that eventually it gangs up on the strongest member if it abuses its strength. And that's what historically has always happened. And I think that unfortunately it will happen to the United States. It's just a matter of time. But I think we're gonna have midterm elections, which may change the internal dynamic before the international dynamic changes. But you can bet China, Russia, they're all watching with great interest what's going on in the Middle East. And Iran's claiming the administration view.
I think you have exhausted our questions. Thank you for joining us and congratulations on your book. The book can be purchased outside and please join us for a reception.
The book is a lot more coherent than my presentation.
Here, glass of water.